Hello everyone, welcome to Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. Pyongyang has been escalating tensions by frequently firing and testing a variety of weapons, and Wednesday morning was not an exception as the regime fired several cruise missiles yet again off the east coast, marking the fifth time this year. Such provocations come amid deepening ties between the regime and Russia, with around 100 Russian tourists visiting Pyongyang for the first time since it reopened its borders in August. Now, in what ways would they strengthen their ties more, and how should South Korea manage its relationship with Russia? For this, we invite Dr. Go Myong-hyun, a senior fellow from the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. Dr. Go, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
And we also have Professor Brian Myers from Dongseo University. Good to have you with us, Professor Myers.
It's great to be back.
All right, Professor Myers, let's start with the latest news. So, North Korea fired several cruise missiles off the east coast this morning, marking the fifth cruise missile launched this year. Why is Pyongyang firing cruise missiles so frequently?
Well, I think part of the answer is the same one we can give in regard to all kinds of tests in North Korea. This is a military-first regime. Much of its legitimacy rests on the claim to be making steady military progress. So they need to display these triumphs on a routine basis. And arms development has its own timetable, just as, say, automotive development does. And testing things is how you refine your designs and you iron out problems and you improve quality. Now, we heard at the top of the hour from the North Korea expert Yang Mu-jin, who reminded us that cruise missile launches do not violate UN sanctions, that the regime could be testing our side's responses to these launches. And I think those factors are indeed playing a role. I would just add, I also think the cruise missile is a weapon that impresses on the South Korean people, particularly the threat that's posed by North Korean armament. For obvious reasons, the ICBMs unsettle the Americans, but they're not perceived by the South Korean people as affecting their own security very much. Whereas that video of the cruise missile hitting its target a few weeks ago, that got a lot of attention here. So I think that propaganda effect may be well intended by the North Koreans as South Korea's general elections draw closer.
All right, I see. So basically, regime is trying to show off its achievements and using it as a propaganda. Right. Well, Dr. Go, North Korea also test-fired 240mm caliber controllable multiple rocket launcher shells on Sunday, according to the KCNA. But what are they used for? And could you tell us more about their latest technical improvements?
So, like a 240mm the rockets are essentially dumb, unguided rockets. So the innovation in this case lies with the fact that North Koreans have been able to at least demonstrate that they have a guiding system small enough to put it on top of these rockets. And the significance of this is more tactical than strategic. North Korea has deployed this simple, rudimentary, powerful though, rocket system, multiple launch rocket systems since 1980s at least. So they have a massive numbers of them, but then they're unguided. And they have a range of 40 kilometers only, so it's a very short. Compared to other types of missiles that North Koreans have in their arsenal. So that's a tactical significance, but has a lot of numbers. But then at the same time, these are like unguided missiles so far. But for the first time, North Koreans have implemented a technical innovation, putting guided system on top of it. So this represents more of a threat. And also, another significance of this is that North Koreans have always had this conventional inferiority compared to South Korea and the United States when it comes to this kind of guided system, precision weaponry, and so forth. But now North Koreans, at least theoretically in this case, demonstrated that they can implement and deploy this kind of a small enough precision guided system at a massive scale. So I think that really the tactical impact of this demonstration.
Right, I see. So the key point is that they have now the guidance capability.
Yeah, for small missiles that they have massive numbers. Yeah.
I see. Well, Professor Myers, as far as I know, it's not just 240mm artillery, but the regime is also known to possess 122 and 300mm shells as well. Now, how are they different from each other, and what artillery is suspected of having this guidance capability already?
Well, I think Dr. Go may know more about these things than I do, but as I understand it as a layman, basically the higher the caliber, the longer the range and the greater the explosive power, but the downside is that you've got less mobility. Now, as for this guidance capability question, my understanding is that the North has at least ordered the development of precision-guided rockets in all three of those caliber categories. I know Kim Jong-un specified the need for guided 122 millimeter shells when he visited, industrial facilities last summer. So, of course, to what extent North Korea has succeeded or can succeed in putting this kind of guided artillery into mass production, that's another question entirely. Of course, the big downside of any guided artillery is the enormous cost. So basically, the logic is you don't need to fire as many shells as you would need to do if they were unguided, but each guided one can be really expensive. So if North Korea can succeed in mass producing and delivering a guided 240 millimeter artillery to the Russians, say, at a steady tempo and a reasonable price, that would be very beneficial for both sides. But quite apart from that, as Dr. Go already said, I think this kind of artillery would pose an obvious threat to the South Korean military.
All right, I see your point, Professor Myers. Now, Dr. Go, until now we have been talking about provocations that already took place. But given that February 16th, which is Friday, is Gwanmyeongsang Day, Kim Jong-il's birthday, should we expect any other provocations to come?
So at this rate of provocations that North Koreans are carrying out, it would be a surprise if North Koreans launched an IRBM or ICBM at this juncture. So, and clearly this is an important time for North Korea, and that they have always used anniversaries like this to mark, essentially, not only to celebrate the anniversary, but also to send a message. And I think Kim Jong-un has been trying to send a very consistent signal to both Seoul and Washington since the beginning of the year, which is that the tension in the peninsula is very high. And the reason why they say that, on top of the actions they're already carrying out, is because they want to develop a leverage over Seoul and Washington, especially because this is a very important election year for both countries. So it wouldn't be inconsistent if North Korea were launched a major provocation. But also, the reason why there are no, reports of signs of North Koreans preparing for a major provocation is because North Korea's technical capability to surprise the world has become more advanced. North Korea has deployed a solid fuel rocket engine. We know that the tactical advantage of such system is that it shortens the window of preparation. So instead of at least requiring at least hours of preparation to erect and launch the missile, now it only takes 20 minutes to bring out their mobile missile launch system out of a shelter and then deploy them and then launch them. And that includes the ICBMs as well now. So I think if North Koreans are preparing provocation like this, say like another ICBM test, which many of us consider to be a major provocation, it's not a surprise that we are not seeing signs of it yet. We only know about it probably a couple of before North Koreans are going to carry out such a provocation. So in a nutshell, it's probably there's a high chance that North Koreans are going to mark this event with some provocation.
All right, that's your point. Now, Professor Myers, let's move on to Russia-North Korea ties. A total of 97 Russian tourists visited Pyongyang for a 4-day trip, becoming the first group of foreign tourists to enter the regime since North Korea reopened its border. Now, what could be the North's intention behind this reopening, and do you expect the North to reopen its border to other foreign nationals as well?
Well, obviously, this is just the beginning of a reopening of tourism, and I think it's going to be a long time before the tourism industry returns to the kind of scale it had, say, 10 years ago. I don't think the revenues are going to make much of a difference, even to a very small economy like North Korea's. But, in my opinion, the regime has always prized foreign tourists mainly for their propaganda value. The North Korean media like to present them to the domestic public as pilgrims who've traveled from far away, even from richer countries, due to their great admiration for North Korea and its leaders. And this is one reason why the tourists get taken to the big leader statues, the sacred historical sites. They're told to bow down or lay flowers. So even though there won't be a huge number of Russian tourists, I think, and they won't be spending much money, I think their presence will be made much of, especially because it confirms that the two countries are coming closer together. And that's reassuring to the North Koreans. And as for opening the country to other foreign tourists, I don't see why not. Of course, the Americans are not going to be returning because of the restrictions that the US government has placed on them. But if the Kim Jong-un regime can make a steady income from tourists who can be displayed to the general public while at the same time being kept away from average citizens, I think that's something that Kim Jong-un is bound to welcome.
All right. Well, Professor Myers, staying on Russia-North Korea ties, actually cooperative ties are expanding much more, not just to tourism, but to giving financial support, with Russia allowing North Korea to withdraw money from frozen North Korean assets. What more should we expect to see between the two ROK states?
Well, yeah, this cooperation, I think, is understandable. It was predictable, really, in view of the fact that Moscow has effectively abandoned its opposition to North Korea's nuclear program. So it really sees no more moral justification to hold on to frozen North Korean assets or to lock the country out of the international banking system. And remember, American domination of the world banking system is something that Russia is determined to undermine in every way possible. And I think this sort of thing kind of deals a blow to American morale, to America's faith in the sanctions regime. Because if you remember, one of the few times that America was able to put a real squeeze on the North Koreans was when it got that Banco Delta Asia to freeze millions of dollars in North Korean funds. Now, again, this is nothing to be surprised by, because Russia is intent on showing the Americans that if they supply its adversary, Ukraine, in the hot conflict, then Russia is going to counter by aiding and abetting America's enemies like North Korea. Now, as for what other types of cooperation we might see, I'm thinking alternative payment systems. I mean, I could see them cooperating with cryptocurrencies. I could see them making financial cooperation even less transparent by going through a third-party country. I think there's quite a few options available for them.
All right, I see. Well, Dr. Go, such deepening ties actually came as a result of the Sochi summit between Kim and Putin last September. How likely is it that Putin will visit Pyongyang after Russia's presidential election is over in March?
So I think it's just still 50-50. I mean, and what determines the chance of Putin reciprocating the visit to North Korea really depends on Russia's relationship with the West after the presidential elections in Russia, as well as the situation on the ground in Ukraine. The reason is because Putin is playing this with this idea, toying with the idea of a reciprocating visit to North Korea, not so much because he wants to pay favor back to Kim Jong-un, but to ensure that South Korea stays on the sidelines of the Ukraine war. Russia knows that South Korea, just like North Korea, has a significant conventional military capability, and therefore it means it can lend significant assistance to Ukraine, which could change the direction of the war against Russia right now. So it's very important for Russia to ensure that South Korea remains on the sidelines. And for the reason alone, Russia has been attaching a lot of significance to this reciprocal visit, just as the North Koreans do. And the reason is because North Koreans know, and the Russians do too, which is in order to upgrade the level of partnership that they have already to a level that is similar to the alliance, that anything similar to the alliance that the South Korea already has with the United States, then they have to have essentially events like this, where the leader of Russia or some other country goes to Pyongyang and shakes hands with Kim Jong-un. And that's been lacking so far. And then when Choi Son-hee, the North Korean foreign minister, visited Russia last year at the behest of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is in truth the other way. It's more like North Korea asked the Russians to allow the foreign minister to go there and then essentially hurry up the Russian side to make a decision about the visit. Then the press release that came out after the meeting was very telling, because Russians still didn't commit to paying the visit to North Korea. So again, this is about Putin trying to maximize the impact of his visit, and if he decides that it's not going to favor Russia's interest, especially in what they have how the interest will affect them if after the war in Ukraine, because Russia needs to maintain relationship with Korea and Japan, because these are major energy consumers of Russian energy. So if that's the case, then I think Russians might, in fact, postpone this visit indefinitely. So still up in the air. So I would say the chance of Putin ever going to Pyongyang is still 50-50.
All right, still up in the air. Now, we are going to talk about why Russia does not want South Korea's direct involvement in Ukrainian war. But before that, Professor Myers, a warning from the Russian ambassador to North Korea. He said that the regime may decide to conduct a seventh nuke test if the U.S. continues with provocative steps. Now, what are the intentions behind such remarks?
Well, I think I interpret that as a clear signal that if North Korea does conduct another nuclear test, Russia will refuse to condemn it in the UN Security Council. And that would, of course, thwart any American or Western efforts to put up a concerted front against the Kim regime. And this is, of course, in contrast to past Russian condemnations of nuclear tests. And that's remarkable on the one side, because these tests are often conducted very close to the North Korean border with Russia. On the other hand, of course, it's understandable because the Americans cannot be supplying Ukraine in a hot war and expect the Russians to cooperate in the Security Council. But the Americans know this already, and the South Koreans, I think, know this already too. So the Russian diplomat's statement, I think, was for the North Koreans' benefit, as Dr. Go indicated, as a show of solidarity, as a show of a kind of quasi-alliance having gone into effect. I don't exclude the possibility that Russia is actually encouraging the North Koreans to act up, because the more the peninsula becomes tense, the closer it becomes to a crisis here, the less time and resources the Americans are going to have for the Ukrainian war effort, which is, of course, already losing the support of the American people. What with Ukraine and Gaza, President Biden already has his hands full, and the last thing he needs to deal with in an election year at that is another North Korean nuclear test, especially as that might give Trump another opportunity to claim that he can handle Kim Jong-un better, whether that's actually true or not.
All right, so such remarks are trying to show solidarity with North Korea, but it's definitely not trying to encourage for North Korea to go on with the nuke test.
It could be an encouragement. I think it could be.
All right, I see. Now, Dr. Go, like I said before, I'd like to shift gears to ties between Russia and South Korea. So Russia has been continuing to put pressure on South Korea, saying it should not support Ukraine with the military aid. Now, what is its intention behind such words?
Well, again, Russia is very aware that there are only two major countries right now that can supply either side of the war with sufficient number of artillery munitions to change the direction of the war. And one is North Korea, which is helping Russia with the munitions assistance, and the other is South Korea. South Korea is probably the only country that has the sufficient capability and technology to help Ukraine, and without the help from the United States, to change the direction of the war. So for Russia, it's very fundamental to ensure that the South Korea remains on the side. And as Professor Myers already mentioned, I think Russia also sees that the Korean theater of the peninsula could be an important proxy battleground, ongoing. I would say like like a war of wills between United States and Russia. Russia has essentially lost all its major levels of influence in the diplomatic stage and the economic stage, even the military stage. And the only thing that Russia is left with right now is the nuclear capability. So Russia has been toying with the idea of carrying out a nuclear test to send a message to the West that it could employ nuclear weapons. And that's the reason why the Russian Congress or Russian Duma decided to abolish their own self-imposed ban on the nuclear test. But then again, this is a major hurdle for a country like Russia, which is a member of the P5 and benefits from the nuclear oligopoly that the non-proliferation regime has granted it. So in this context, if they know they can carry out the nuclear test, but will come out with a high cost. But if North Korea does that, then they'll carries out the much anticipated seventh nuclear test. So even though test that takes place in North Korea, by inference, I think the rest of the world will infer automatically that, look, nuclear weapons is real, tests can take place, and therefore I would say the impact of a nuclear blackmail by proxy is going to benefit Russia. So in that sense, Russia is in its interest to essentially encourage North Korea to become more aggressive this year. And then this way also, it actually ensures that South Korea's attention stays in the Korean Peninsula, not elsewhere.
All right. Now, before we wrap up this show, Professor Myers, I'd like to ask you this last question. So, based on our discussion today, how should Seoul manage ties with Russia?
Well, you know, Seoul is in a quandary because the U.S., this country's military ally, is in an adversarial relationship with some of South Korea's big trading partners. And of course, Russia is one of those trade partners. It's not hugely important, but for years now, it's been a growing market for South Korean cars and machinery, and Russian consumers have an awful lot of goodwill for the Made in Korea label. And as Dr. Go pointed out, South Korea is a really big consumer of Russian oil and raw materials. So the situation now kind of reminds me of the situation that previous administrations were in during the two Gulf Wars, when the South Koreans needed to make the Americans happy on the military front, and at the same time, they needed to maintain a good relationship with Arab trade partners. And those two presidents, No Tae-woo and No Moo-hyun, they did a very good job of walking that tightrope. Whereas I think, you know, when I see things from a South Korean perspective, that President Yoon has maybe been a little bit intemperate with his rhetoric in regard to Ukraine, and the South Korean weapons industry has perhaps given too much of the impression that it's eager to supply weapons to countries that are hostile or potentially hostile to Russia. So I think South Korea might benefit from toning down some of its declarations of support for the Ukrainian war effort. And I think it might also benefit from keeping the long-term trade picture in mind instead of going all out for a quick windfall in the arms market. But of course, you know, that goes for both sides. It's in Russia's interests to restore a good relationship with South Korea. And that means that Putin should perhaps avoid throwing in his lot completely with the regime in Pyongyang. And that means it would indeed be, I think, in Russia's interests for Putin not to visit Pyongyang.
All right, I see. Well, thank you for your advice, Professor Myers. Now, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you, Professor Myers and Dr. Go, for your time and insights.
Thank you.
We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.